The Count, Berserk's first major antagonist, a character that to this day is still part of many discussions when talking about the moral complexity that is a common reoccurrence in Kentaro Miura's work. A victim, yet a terrible being, the Count walks the fine line between being sympathetic and despicable. He is not a shallow villain, making him the perfect choice to be the first major antagonist our first protagonist faces, because it establishes a foundation that's vital for the rest of the series. And I feel conflicted about this apostle, and it would seem that that's an appropriate feeling to have when you look at discussions regarding this character. There's people that feel very sorry for the guy and feel he is justified in what he did, and on the other hand, you've got people who despise the Count for he is a monster and no amount of suffering one has dealt with makes it so one is justifiable in the actions that the Count did. With that being said, like most of my videos when talking about evil characters, it's important to use nuance, and with the Count, that is no different. In terms of the structure of this video, I'm going to talk about the Count differently to how Miura presented the information to us. Miura first showed us the monstrous side, and it ends with the more tragic side. With my video, I'm going to kind of flip that, and I will tell you why later in the video. Before he ascended to apostlehood, the Count was in fact a respected nobleman and ruler over a city. He was in a position of power, tasked with maintaining order in his territory. Exterminating heretics was one of his main goals. The Count's daughter, Theresia, when talking about her father's past to Puck, says that though her father was strict, he was a great ruler, defending his kingdom against his enemies. He was loved and trusted by many. In regard to his personal life, he had a virtuous, beautiful wife, with whom he had Theresia. They seemed like a healthy, happy family by all accounts. Some may think that his work is something to find fault with. After all, how many people have died under his command? And how many have unjustly so perished? It's a bloody line of work. However, on a personal level, I would say that the Count did not enjoy what he was doing. It was just his responsibility. And I have concluded that from once more detail when Ubik gives us his backstory. The Count rushed back to the arms of his beloved wife and daughter in order to soothe his soul. The line "to soothe his soul" indicates that the Count was struggling morally with his actions and likely didn't despise the heretics. He just saw them as being a nuisance, ruining his land for him and his people. And so ending their life didn't sit right with them. And he would be away often from his lover and daughter because of his duty. And one day, after returning from a long heretic hunting campaign, the Count was exhausted and wanted to soothe his soul by being with his loving wife and daughter, only to have a life-shattering experience. He sees this. A wave of heat hits his face, accompanied by a strange stench, a sea of heretics in a tangled mess. But worst of all, there was a woman clinging to the strange statue who was in pure ecstasy. It was none other than his wife. That picture in people's head of this family being a happy and healthy one is all but an illusion. Unfortunately, we are not given any information on the wife's perspective and thoughts. This backstory is told through the eyes of the Count, so we only get his side. All we know for a fact is that the wife at some point ended up joining the heretic cult and chose to be unfaithful towards him by inviting the heretics into his home and having this party. She does have a knowing smile at the end, which could suggest she has some disdain for the Count, but because of the lack of information around her, we don't know if she always had this hatred for the Count or if it began after she started experiencing her freedom with the heretics. The Count loved his wife very dearly and would hunt heretics entirely to try and ensure his lands would be safe for her and his daughter, only to return home and find the very woman he loved most was engaging in that behaviour with his enemy. No other word than betrayal is fitting, and understandably so. The Count is filled with great rage, and no one but himself and his supposed virtuous wife was left breathing in the room. Standing above his betrayer, about to swing his blade once more, the wife appears to welcome the blade, and despite the Count being broken from this event, he chooses not to kill her. He sees the triumphant known smile on the woman he loves, which drove him to the deepest despair, where he finds himself completely isolated and with no other choice but to end it all. Of course, this activates the Belit, in which summons the God Hand, and he is clearly in desperation as he looks to these daunting figures as the way to alleviate his suffering. And yeah, we know how this goes. He makes a sacrifice, and who else could that be but the lover who has just recently stabbed him in the back. What's interesting here is that even though this broke the Count, he still would rather self-delete than kill his wife. Yet when the Belit activated, he would choose to sacrifice his wife, which means there's some part of him that held strong hatred towards his wife, and considering what she did, I can't say I don't blame him. In fact, this is one of the only times I'm completely on the Count's side. Should he have killed everyone in that room and doomed his wife to be a sacrificial offering? Well, not exactly, but all I'll say is that you kinda asked for it. Fuck around and find out. Something to know is that Theresia loved her mother very much. The Count gives Theresia a false story about her mother to spare her from the truth. It's likely she was a nice woman for the majority of the marriage, at least to her daughter, but regardless of any of that, when someone suffers a betrayal such as this, it dominates everything the relationship is. Feelings of affection, heartwarming memories are all overshadowed by the emotions that are brought on from the Count discovering what his wife was up to. From the point he turned into an apostle, he changed quite dramatically, which we will soon discuss. The relationship between the Count and his daughter becomes distant, as Theresia knows her father has changed and is weary of him, and the Count forbade his daughter from leaving her bedchambers. This is likely out of fear that the outside world would somehow corrupt Theresia in a similar way to his once wife, as he believes heretics are a disease that turn anything that is pure to become impure. We know this because of the first scene we are given where there's a different side to him. He gives the captured puck as a gift to his daughter as an attempt at a kind gesture. He can tell his daughter is lonely but tells her to be patient until heretics are no more. He is overprotective to a negative degree, sure, essentially locking his daughter in her bedroom. But it is a twisted sense of love, and considering that at this point he is a monster, it is still leaps and bounds away from other evil entities in this world. There's a moment where the Count tries to touch his daughter but she jolts back, and you see the anguish on his face as he asks,
"You still won't let me touch you?"
He senses his daughter's unease and leaves the room, and is angry that his daughter rejected him. Now, when I first read this, I thought this part was to signify that something more disturbing was going on. But in actuality, the reason for Theresia's action is that she is frightened of her father, because she knows for a fact he isn't the same man he used to be.
I'm not half the man I used to be.
And from the Count's point of view, he just loves his daughter the way a typical father does. He is one of the only individuals in the story who genuinely loves his daughter, and not in that disgusting way. And lastly, the crux of people's argument for why they don't assign the Count as being a 100% evil character is his choice not to sacrifice his daughter. In his final confrontation with Guts, they caused a lot of destruction. It opened a way for Theresia to enter the room where the carnage was taking place. We get a heartbreaking moment from Theresia when she sees her father's true form for the first time, where her fears are now her reality. She screams in terror. The Count is sad that his daughter sees him like this. Later in the battle, Guts uses Theresia as a human shield, which stops the Count in his tracks and allows Guts to land a devastating blow on the Count. Now, this was the time when Guts was at his most vengeful, and he starts torturing the apostle. In the eyes of Theresia, Guts looks just as demonic as her father, to the point where she pleads for Guts to stop. But he goes further with him and continues his torture, which is likely to traumatize the young girl. Guts is so extra here that he slips and laughs his ass off like he's the Joker. And feeling his end is approaching, the Count desperately yells, "I don't want to die!" And the Baler activates once again. Here we see the God Hand appear and the God Hand grants the Count the ability to live if he's willing to sacrifice, and of course this means his last tie to his humanity, his daughter. The Count pleads, anyone but his daughter. Ubik jumps in by telling the Count it will just be like the last time. This is where us, the audience, alongside Theresia, learn the Count's backstory that I have already included in this video. After hearing the information about the true nature of her mother's disappearance, Theresia is not in a good place, both mentally and physically, as it might be she who is next to be sacrificed. Showing him the fate that awaits him if he declines the God Hand's offer, the Count is feeling his body go cold and understands that he will live eternity in hell. He is milliseconds from uttering the critical phrase till he sees the face of his innocent daughter with tears pouring from her eyes, and there he makes his decision. He will not sacrifice her. When people debate about whether the Count is a sympathetic villain or not, this is always the scene that people point to argue that he is worthy of showing sympathy for. And for good reason, right? The easiest way to distinguish good people from bad is that bad people tend to be selfish. It's about me, myself, and I. That's a core principle of evil people in the world and fiction. And so here, the Count has an opportunity to do a selfish act, and it would be so easy to do so, considering the circumstance. But his decision to spare his daughter and doom himself to the abyss is truly a selfless choice. And first time reading this, you're actually taken aback and you're like, alright, he's not totally awful. But with hindsight and having experienced nearly 400 chapters of this story, which have included many terrible people, both demons and ordinary people, looking back at the Count's decision, it's even more surprising action considering he is an apostle. And apostles are supposed to be the worst of the worst in the world of Berserk. My personal view on this is that the Count has a large capacity to love through his wife and his daughter. And it's that love that he had for his wife that was destroyed that drove him to the darkest point in his life. If you can love intensely, it means you can also hate just as easily. And that's what happened. The intense emotions he felt put him in a hopeless position in which he made a permanent decision. There was likely a productive discussion that needed to occur between the Count and his wife as to why she did what she did, but feeling betrayed caused him to be emotionally rash. The decision he made is one in which he probably questions from time to time, and the monster he became was fueled by the great darkness that he experienced on that day. But he knows his daughter is innocent. She's done nothing to hurt him. You can argue whether the wife deserved what happened to her, but that is off the table when it comes to Theresia. And when the Count looks at his daughter, contemplating his choice, he understands that. So props to the Count for this being what he does in his final moments. However, so far, I have been portraying the Count in a more positive light, but everything we will discuss next will show you that he might not be so worthy of your sympathy after all. Because once he becomes the Slug Count, he does many malicious actions that, in my estimation, far outweigh any good he does and might be capable of. There's a reason why I've structured the details of the Count differently from Miura. That's because the most memorable moment of the Count is his final moments, which I've already detailed as both tragic and sad. And so when he exits the story, we remember that part of him the most. And everything we saw before, it kind of becomes forgotten because we're left with the feeling of, oh, he isn't totally evil. Don't get me wrong, it's a formula for villains that is extremely effective in storytelling, and I wouldn't have wanted Miura to do it any other way. I'm just saying, when discussing the character itself, his last moments tend to leave a lasting impression on people which can affect their judgment. So I want you to recognize all the good the Count does in the story, because now we're going to talk about everything that is the opposite of that word. The first time we see the Count in the story, the setting is incredibly dark. There's a public execution being held under the command of the Count himself. It seems people are being executed for allegedly being heretics, perhaps unfairly so, as the woman who is about to be executed is screaming her innocence. The man who read out the verdict questions the Count about the number of executions that are taking place, but he simply doesn't care. He claims that what he is doing is in the interest of his own people. One thing that has dramatically changed since becoming an apostle is that his heretical hunts became more like hate-fueled purges. Instead of it being a necessary duty, now it is personal, where once he ruled intending to keep his city safe, he now rules with fear, and that's how the people stay loyal. To everyone else, it just seemed like a zealous lord defending order and religion. But when we come to learn his backstory, really his mission to execute and torture heretics is because of the experience of betrayal by his wife. It's his motivation that keeps him on this path, punishing his wife's memory through others. Also, this fanatical situation is similar to a certain character later in the story, which makes sense because the Count's city falls under the Holy See's jurisdiction. But his wrath extends beyond just heretics, as ordinary people are not safe either. We know this through the story of the castle's physician, Vargas, who isn't going to be getting any calls from a modeling agency anytime soon. He recalls a time when the Count changed 7 years ago, and where he transitioned into a more violent and bloodthirsty being. Dissecting people alive and violating and eating them are things that often happened. His inquisition of heretics became an excuse to acquire more bodies, Vargas claims. He had seen enough of the horrors and decided to flee the castle with his wife and 2 sons, but of course, he and his family were captured. You see, there's a reason why Vargas looks like this in the present day. That's because the Count would cut parts of him off and eat them.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
And worst of all, the reason why Vargas wants revenge is that he saw with his own eyes the Count eating and swallowing his wife and 2 sons. And right in front of him, the Count decided to do this. A heinous act, no doubt. The reason why Vargas is still living is that he managed to fake his own death and use it as a way to escape. Now we will come back to him because his story isn't over just yet. We can assume from Vargas's account that for the 7 years the Count has been an apostle, that this awful behaviour is a normal everyday thing for the monster. And without any chance of things changing, the Count would likely continue his destruction. But fortunately for the majority of the kingdom, the Count's life would soon cease to be, as the thing that is to come for all apostles is on the Count's front doorstep: Guts, who enters the city as the very first execution we see is taking place. He taunts by throwing the head right back at the Count, which the Count views as a declaration of war. And in typical monstrous fashion, he crushes the head of the executed woman and laughs maniacally on his throne. He is looking forward to a challenge. When Guts encounters Vargas, the decrepit man sees the strength that the Black Swordsman holds might finally be his way to achieve vengeance upon the Count. Meanwhile, Zondark, one of the Count's best soldiers who recently suffered a defeat from Guts, also wants his revenge, and the Count sees this as a perfect opportunity to get rid of the Black Swordsman by turning Zondark into a pseudo-apostle. And Zondark didn't ask for this, by the way. When Guts departs from Vargas, we get a nice little interaction between Puck and Vargas. The elf gives words of encouragement to Vargas, telling him to keep going, which is a sweet thing. But we can't have nice things and Vargas gets captured, and he is to be executed immediately. Guts has a chance to interfere, but he's like, I ain't doing all that. Vargas does have some last words to say to the Count, basically telling him, you're gonna die, motherfucker. And the soft-hearted Puck tries to save Vargas, but he isn't able to. Instead, he is captured, and this is when you get the scene where you first discover that the Count has a daughter, which we've already discussed this scene. But once the Count leaves the room, Theresia and Puck begin to converse. This is where Theresia tells us her knowledge in regards to her mother's disappearance. We know her father fabricated a story to keep her from learning the painful truth. Theresia also talks about the change in her father and dreams of one day escaping the walls of her bedroom to become free like a bird. We then get the final confrontation between Guts and the Count, and if it were not for Theresia entering the room and being the Achilles heel for the monstrous apostle, Guts may have perished in his recklessness. From that point on, you get the tragic backstory and the Count's final moments, which, like I said before, puts an unfairly charitable filter on his character. I think the reason for this is that the sorrowful side to the Count is explained more thoroughly, and though we see the Count do terrible things in the story, we mainly just hear of his terrible actions rather than see them. This doesn't have quite the same impact as the backstory stuff and his choice to spare his daughter. But what you have to realise is that for the 7 years that we did not see, the Count was doing what he did to Vargas to others on a daily basis. And that's not to be ignored. Unfortunately, he was projecting his self-hatred onto others. Deep down, the Count despises himself for killing his wife, for failing as a strong man. Instead of dealing with it productively, he finds it much easier to go down the path of destruction. It's a cycle of vengeance that parallels Guts' journey after the eclipse. And what we need to talk about next is how the Slug Count relates to others in the story. First, I want to talk about the Count's daughter Theresia. I see a similarity between her and Princess Charlotte. Both have overprotective fathers who do not allow them outside the walls of the castle. Both want to experience freedom beyond their surroundings, and they both experience something that traumatizes them for the rest of their life. Theresia loses virtually everything and says that she'd rather be dead, where Guts chimes in and says, go ahead, kill yourself.
Emotional, damn it!
To where it seems she's about to till the ground beneath her collapses and Guts actually saves her in the moment. Theresia then points to Guts as the reason why everything that is bad is happening, vowing to one day kill Guts. She is directing her hate at him, and yet again, the cycle of revenge continues, from father now to the daughter. I don't need it, but I am interested in what potentially happened to Theresia. I think maybe she turned into someone similar to the young Guts we see before he encounters the Band of the Hawk, a loner who doesn't have a want for attachment. Maybe she died from a disease or was killed by another apostle, or worst of all to me, maybe the world consumed her and she ended her suffering, something that her dad was on the verge of doing but didn't. Theresia, unlike her father, would follow through on that. Also, this anger she has towards Guts at the end parallels Guts when he was fresh off the eclipse. And I think he knows that, for we get this panel that to this day is still one of my favourites in the whole series. It's beautiful in so many ways because it says so much by doing so little. Guts knows that anyone who comes into contact with him is basically doomed. Either they die or they are scarred by the events that happened while he was around. He knows he has ruined this little girl's life and made her just like himself. And this reaction is the realization of that. The Count and Guts also mirror each other in various ways. The most obvious one is that they're both consumed by hate. The Count for what happened with his wife, and Guts because of the eclipse. They both fight for a personal vendetta. They are still chained by the past. The Count's existence as an apostle is fueled by the betrayal he suffered from his wife. Guts is forever haunted by Griffith's betrayal. It will always be a part of him no matter what. And his whole mission at this point is to take out that false god. He is also literally branded, a constant reminder of the eclipse and that he is a sacrificial offering. The two also tend to leave people behind. The Count, of course, leaves his daughter behind, who becomes traumatized because of the event. And Guts leaves behind many people, from Jill in the Lost Children chapters, Casca and Rickett after the eclipse, and he even leaves behind Theresia too. So she got the double whammy there. In both cases, innocents are forced to live with the aftermath caused by these two. But ultimately, the division between the two is that the Count gets completely consumed by his hatred and becomes a monster. Guts was well on his way to that destination, but as time goes on and his heart shines through his tough exterior, Guts looks like he is deviating from that path. Characters like the Count are a look at what Guts could become if he followed in the same footsteps. So I agree with people who think the Count is one of the few sympathetic villains in the Berserk story. But is he more sympathetic than a character like Rosine?
No.
Rosine is a child, and though what she did was awful, she's a child for God's sake. The Count is an adult, and though what he suffered could make a lot of people go crazy, nothing that he does after his wife's betrayal is justifiable. It's understandable, but that don't make it right. I would also like to note that we are told his backstory through the Count's perspective, his POV. We don't hear the wife's side at any point. And I think it doesn't matter to the story it's trying to tell. It's a story of how someone came to be a horrendous creature. Hearing the wife's side wouldn't be necessary. Also, we get told the backstory by Ubik. Ubik is the storyteller one of the God Hand. Later with Griffith, we see inside Griffith's mind, and though Ubik likely doesn't make any false claims, his goal is to push them towards making a sacrifice. He doesn't make them do it, he's just like, look at all the darkness in your life. He wouldn't say something like, well buddy, your life sucks at the moment, but you know, there's always a chance for things to get better. Imagine what your daughter could grow up to be. Maybe you'll find someone else in your life that you will love equally as your past wife. Nah, Ubik is like, bro, your life sucks. You should probably end it all. But we've got a special deal going on at the moment. You can be free of suffering for the price of someone special to you. He's obviously biased. He doesn't lie, he just sells them the idea that this is their only choice, to coax them into making a terrible decision. Anyways, I'm derailing a little here. All I will say is that, yes, the Count has a tragic past, but that doesn't change the fact that he is an awful being, who has tortured and killed people unjustly in terrible ways. It's a look into how, even if a person is good for their entire life, it sometimes can only take one bad day for that person to turn into a monster. The Count also killed Pippin, so screw you.